The camera aperture, controlling the amount of light. The aperture and its primary effect. The aperture is one of three parts that make up the exposure triangle. Each of these settings control exposure or light in its own way. This is the primary effect for each part. What is an aperture? The opening that allows light into the camera. An aperture is located inside of the camera lens. It is the opening that allows light to pass into the body of the camera. The aperture is controlled by the camera and is able to get larger and smaller, which in turn lets in more or less light. It controls the amount of light let in. Here you can see a visual demonstration of the aperture changing and the amount of light increasing or decreasing as the aperture closes down or opens up. The wider the opening of the aperture, the more light is able to enter the camera, and the more exposed the photograph will be. The reverse also applies. The smaller the aperture, the less light will be let in, so the photograph will be less exposed. How is it created? The aperture itself is formed by a series of metal or plastic blades called the diaphragm. These blades open and close, which creates different sized holes, and this forms the aperture. How do you control the aperture? On your camera, you'll find a setting called the f-stop, which appears as a number with an F next to it. An f-stop is a unit of measurement for the size of an aperture, like how an inch or a foot measures length. Look at the relationship between the aperture size and the f-stop number in the picture on the left. This is where things get a little bit confusing. There is an inverse relationship between the aperture size and the stop number. A lower f-stop means a larger aperture, more light. A higher f-stop means a smaller aperture and less light. Now we get to the secondary effect. This is where things get creative. The secondary effect of an f-stop is actually something we've already talked about a few times: depth of field. Depth of field is the area of a photograph from near to far that is in focus. There are two types we'll refer to: shallow depth of field and large depth of field. Depth of field. F-stops and depth of field are directly related, unlike the relationship between f-stop numbers and apertures. A low f-stop will give you a shallow depth of field. Only a little bit of the photograph will be in focus. Where a higher f-stop will give you a large depth of field. Most or all of the photograph is in focus. Here you see a shallow depth of field example. The model is standing there, she is in focus. The tennis balls in front and behind her are where the focus stops and starts to fall off. This is at f2. Now an example of large depth of field, f22. You see the model is still the main focal point, but where now if you look to the side, you're going to see that the tennis balls now, rather than being inches like they were in the last photograph, they are now feet apart. So that entire area between those tennis balls are actually in focus. That is a large depth of field. Compare this to something that you see every day on people. Your eyes. Overall, a camera is designed to work very similar to your eyes. The pupil can be compared to the aperture. Take the image on the left. You're going to see that that is a smaller pupil. This is because the more light that enters your eye, the smaller your pupils will get. This is in order to limit the amount of light entering the eye. Conversely, if you look at the right image, the pupil is much larger. This happens when you walk into a dark room and your pupils get rather massive. This is because it's trying to let as much light in as possible and let you see. Shallow depth of field. Let's look at a few examples of different depth of fields. For example, here we're going to look at some portraits, macro, and sports. For shallow or small depth of field, this means that only a small amount of the photograph is in focus. Macro. Think of using shallow depth of field as taking a distracting, detailed background and simplifying it into a blurry mess. Macro photography, like these examples, always use a shallow depth of field. Sports. Using a simplified background also helps separate your subject from the background, like in sports where you want people to only focus on the subject or the action happening and not be distracted from the background. Large depth of field. On the other hand, a large depth of field means most or all of the photograph is in focus. Examples like landscapes and architecture. This is typically an image where everything is sharp and clear. Landscapes. This is typically when you want your viewer to see everything in the image. Using a small aperture to include the background area in the photograph is typically best when you're taking landscape photos. Architecture. The same can be applied when photographing architecture like interior design or cityscapes. You want your viewers to be able to see as much detail as possible. Your camera settings. When you switch to AV mode, you will see a screen similar to this one. You will see arrows next to the f-stop, the number with the F next to it. This indicates that you have control of that setting. Assuming that you've set your ISO to auto, your camera is then going to take care of the ISO and the shutter speed for you, according to your choice of f-stop. AV mode. All you have to do to change the f-stop when you're in AV mode is turn the main dial left or right. You should see the f-stop move up and down. If you have a touchscreen, you can hit the Q and then move it up and down. The lenses on our classroom cameras will have a range of f4 to f22, but each lens will be different.